For questions. We have Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews here today. I want to thank you, sir, for your service and your courage for testifying before this committee almost a year ago to the day. He was a sniper at Abbey Gate and testified to us that he had the suicide bomber in his sights, that was identified on the Be on the Lookout. He sent the sniper photos and other related documents to his commanding officer for permission to engage the suicide bomber. Yet that warning was ignored. He never heard back. I and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, after that testimony, sent a letter to the Department of Defense requesting that these documents and sniper photos be delivered to the Congress, produced to the Congress by this document, this letter request. To date, that has been ignored. The Department of Defense has refused. We've also requested the testimonies of General Chris Donahue and Admiral Peter Vaisley, who were the commanding officers on the ground during the Abbey Gate disaster. To both of you, to General Milley, do you think that these documents should be turned over to the United States Congress? And do you think that both General Donahue and Admiral Vaisley should testify before Congress?
Sure, I absolutely do. I believe transparency. You're the board of directors for this corporation called the American government, and I believe that you're entitled to those within the bounds of classification. Absolutely. So whatever documents are out there should be turned over to the appropriate committees of jurisdiction and oversight. And whatever witnesses are needed to establish truth and transparency within the bounds of classification should absolutely happen. Absolutely. That's why I'm here.
Thank you.
Chairman, I agree with General Milley, and I associate myself with his remarks.
So also on accountability, I've asked the State Department officials who was responsible for the catastrophic emergency evacuation. Not surprisingly, they point their fingers at the Department of Defense. But I want to set the record straight. While the DoD helps conduct the emergency evacuation, it's a State Department that is responsible under law for developing the plan and leading the evacuation. Is that your understanding?
Yes. The State Department is the lead federal agency for planning and execution, oversight of the execution of the non-combatant operation. And the Department of Defense is in support of, and other departments are in support of the State Department. The State Department's the lead federal agency for NEOs. That's correct.
General McKenzie?
I agree with that.
And it's a State Department responsible under law, again, for requesting the emergency evacuation. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I think that's done at the ambassadorial level, to tell you the truth. I'd have to check the law, but I think the ambassador can make the decision to execute a NEO, but typically it'll be him or the Secretary of State.
And did the State Department, specifically Embassy Kabul, have an evacuation plan for Afghanistan?
So, Chairman, every embassy has an evacuation plan for Afghanistan, and Embassy Kabul had a plan, had what we would call an F-77 list, which is the list of U.S. Citizens and their families that are in the country, and we struggled to gain access to that plan and work with them over the months of July until we finally got a decision to execute the NEO, which, as I've already mentioned, occurred on the 14th of August. Now, we worked with the embassy before then, but we didn't have authority to move out and do the things that you have to do to make a NEO happen until the 14th of July, or correction, the 14th of August. And as I noted, we were in extremis at that point.
And August 14th, just days before the fall of Kabul and the evacuation of the embassy, August 14th is when they finally put forward this plan?
Now, that's when we got authority to execute the plan.
That's when you got authority to, and you urged the White House and State Department to put pen to paper to develop a plan to get Americans and our Afghan allies out of Afghanistan, correct?
Yes, I did. In fact, I was concerned by the middle of July. I was concerned about the different pace of Department of Defense planning as compared to Department of State planning. And I took an opportunity then to make representations to the Secretary about my concern over that, the fact that we were moving pretty fast on this. They were not moving fast, and I was concerned that we were going to arrive at different locations just based on it. And I went to the Secretary. We spent some time talking about that, and actually followed up with a written idea on some things that we could do. Sent a letter with 10 recommendations to the Secretary of Defense on that.
And is that your recollection, General Milley?
Absolutely. Without breaching things like executive privilege, et cetera, my assessments at the time, and Frank McKenzie submitted assessments, Scott Miller submitted assessments, the general consensus of the military, up through and including the Secretary of Defense, was that the embassy should be coming out, roughly speaking, at the same time we should be coming out. And then after the decisions were made to keep a diplomatic presence there, as the situation deteriorated through the summer and the fall of the provincial capitals, et cetera, we were clearly pressing for early calls to execute a NEO.
And they did eventually develop a plan?
Well, go ahead on the planning.
So they had a plan. Like I said, it's a requirement to have the plan, but it's one thing to have the plan. It's a second thing to do the actual coordination on the plan, to talk about the specifics of execution. So having a plan is one thing, preparing the plan, vetting the plan, coordinating the plan with the people that are going to actually carry you out, the Department of Defense, that's another set of tasks completely.
And that was too little, too late.
It is my judgment that it was far too little, far too late.
Was that your assessment, General Milley?
It was, and I would broaden it a little bit by saying it was a pretty consistent assessment by me and other members of the uniformed military, up to and including the Secretary, that the withdrawal of the military forces and the contractors and the NATO forces that went with it would ultimately lead, as I said in my opening statement, to a general collapse of the ANSF and the government. And as I mentioned, the tension was, when would those conditions be made? It was also our assessment at the time that keeping an embassy open in a war zone, which Afghanistan was, and to do that without the presence of the U.S. military and the contractors, NATO, et cetera, that embassy would be untenable.
And that was your advice to the State Department and the White House?
Well, as you know, because of the requirements of executive privilege, et cetera, I can tell you what my assessments were at the time, and those were my thoughts at the time.
Do you believe that their failure to plan timely created the chaos at HKIA Airport?
I think the call to execute the NEO came too late, and as General McKenzie mentioned, it was officially logged in on the 14th. At that point in time, the Afghan government senior leadership was preparing to depart, and they departed the next day on the 15th. Thousands of Afghan civilians were gathering at the airport. The Afghan security forces were collapsing in the various provincial capitals, and although there were some still in and around Kabul. So the general situation at that point, with 750 U.S. soldiers in and around the embassy, the Turkish troops were required, along with some ANSF, to protect HKIA. They melted away. So you had a situation with the U.S. Embassy and 750 troops when that NEO was called, and now we had leaned forward. So I think it's the 9th, 10th, or 11th time frame. We had already put forces on alert, et cetera. But in essence, we alerted, Marshal deployed 82nd Airborne Division, Division Ready Brigade, and the MU out of Saudi that was underneath General McKenzie's control. They rapidly deployed along with special forces to take control of that airport. It took two to 3 days. That's where those videos come from. But they eventually wrested control of that airport.
And General McKenzie, you agree with that assessment?
I do. That reflects the opinion I had at the time and the opinion I had now.
Yeah, I believe that accountability ensures mistakes of the past are not repeated. But from where I sit, the President and this administration refuse to acknowledge their failures. There's an inscription at the National Archives down the street that reads, "What is past is prologue." Now, I launched this investigation to make sure that the mistakes made in Afghanistan never, ever happen again. With that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying thank you. You are you're here voluntarily, is that correct?
Correct.
That is correct, sir.
Although you did receive the threat of a subpoena at one point. Is that also correct?
Received
a threat of being subpoenaed to come today?
Chairman McCall mentioned that he wanted us to appear and that there are compulsory measures, which I took to mean subpoena, sure. But look at, that wasn't necessary from the beginning.
I know you came voluntarily, but I just want to get the point out that there was something in regards to